On April 9th of 1967, right here in Chicago, at the New Covenant Baptist Church, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached a sermon he titled, "The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life." That sermon was one that hit home with the author of the book we're using during Lent. According to Reverend Moss, Dr. King described the three sides like this. The first side is personal, the second side is communal, and the third side is spiritual. Moss defines the personal as authentic fulfillment of the self. He describes the communal as social engagement and responsibility. He describes the spiritual as our sacred kinship and connection with all creation. I appreciate Moss's descriptions. In the sermon that he preached about this, Dr. King used the greatest commandment to depict all three. He used love of self, love of neighbor, and love of God. And his point was that we are to get right with all three of them. What Moss has done is broaden them just a bit in ways that I think are accessible and intentionally interfaith and interspiritual, since he knows that a variety of people will be reading his book, not just Christian folks. Part of the concept that we're to understand here in Dr. King's sermon and Moss's description of it is the concept of balance. Dr. King said, "Life as it should be, and life at its best, is a life that is complete on all sides. And there are three dimensions of any complete life to which we can fitly give the words of this text: length and breadth and height." What he's talking about there is balance. If you try to build a house and you're not careful to consider length, or you're not careful to consider breadth or height, your house is definitely going to be off balance and unlivable. You can't have a house that is all length or all breadth or all height. It just doesn't work. So what does that balance look like in a life? The parable of the Good Samaritan, as it is called, is familiar to many of us. And it's a story that gets told over and over. I don't even know how many times I have told that story in my 31 years, but many times. We keep telling it because of its power and because it's a message we constantly need to hear. I chose it as a text to go with this theme in particular because in my thinking, I was imagining that it had at least two of the three sides. As I reread the text again, I realized it does have all three sides if you include the animal that the Samaritan has with him, which is the interconnection piece. So we really do have all three sides in the story. We have a man who's traveling along the Jericho Road when he sees that someone has been beaten and robbed and left for dead. He stopped to care for the person. When I read through the sermon that Dr. King wrote, that Dr. Moss referred to in the book, I was very surprised to see that in that sermon, he too brings in the text of the Good Samaritan. As he interprets it, he calls our attention to the fact that when the lawyer asked Jesus who his neighbor is, Jesus takes the question and immediately puts it in a real location, the Jericho Road. The Jericho Road is a winding and curving and meandering road, which makes it a road conducive to robbery and violence. Everyone who would have heard this story live, as Jesus told it, would have immediately been able to picture this road in their minds. And then Dr. King tells us to take a little bit of a different look at the priest and the Levite. We have all kinds of theories about why they didn't stop to help the man, many of them being religious-based. Dr. King says that there are more than enough theories out there, but that he believes at the heart of the issue was they were simply afraid. It was plain and simple fear. They asked themselves when they saw the man, what will happen to me if I stop? Now, I will say a good number of us probably wouldn't have stopped either. And a good number of us have probably walked by or driven by people we saw at the side of the figurative road and did not stop to help when we asked the question, what will happen to me if I stop? I have definitely done that, and I've done it even on my way to church. Cars that are stuck at the side of the road and I blow on by because I got to get to church. Fear gets in our way of a balanced life. What I found most fascinating about Dr. King's conclusion is that the Samaritan was great because he was willing to take a risk for humanity. He was willing to ask this question, what will happen to this man if I don't stop? Instead of the question, what will happen to me if I stop? So how do we balance the personal authenticity, the social and communal responsibility, and sacred kinship and connection with all creation? How do we get to a place of living like the Samaritan, who, by the way, cared for himself too? He left the inn when he needed to, and then came back when he could. He also cared for the one robbed and beaten, and then he cared for the innkeeper by making sure the innkeeper was paid the money that it would take to care for the injured one. He also cared for the animal that was with him. So let's begin with the personal authenticity that Moss believes is the first part of a balanced life. To be fully ourselves is a process. There are different stages in our lives when we are more or less able to know ourselves as we really are and to live from that place. When we're in school and living at home, for example, we often feel pressure to conform to some idea of what our parents or our teachers or our coaches want us to be or hope we will be. At some point we leave home and we go to college or we begin to work. And in that setting, we can be heavily influenced by our friends or our social groups. And then if we end up with a partner, sometimes we end up being influenced by that partner, but sometimes we end up being swallowed whole by that partner. There are people who go through their entire lives living according to the expectations of others, rather than who they are or how they want to be living. One way of stating this is that we reject ourselves based on all of the opinions and needs and expectations around us. On the other hand, there are people who shed identities along the way and begin to have a clearer sense of who they are and who they want to be. Personal authenticity is being able to live one's life and use one's voice no matter who is in the room at the time. It's not being afraid of being disliked or seen as less than in some way. For Dr. King and Dr. Moss, both of whom are black men, one of the examples of this is not living in the image of white people who want them to be a particular way, but living into their full and gifted selves. We've seen over time that race and gender and sexuality and age and ability and beliefs and politics and class can all get in the way of being our full selves. I would add that one of the biggest obstacles to personal authenticity is addiction. I'm talking about all kinds of addictions and not just substances. Addiction keeps us from being our best and full selves. Sometimes what leads to addiction is the disconnection or disappointment we feel in ourselves. It can also be the need to constantly please others, that idea of self-rejection that I just mentioned. Addiction keeps us in a fog, and when we're able to heal through it, we begin to see and know ourselves again. Some of the most authentic people you will meet can be people who have gotten sober from whatever their addiction. We can be addicted to partners who are unhealthy for us, to pleasing other people even when it brings harm to us. We can be addicted to work, to people in charge, to certain habits, to perfection, to being in the limelight, even to our own egos. Addiction keeps us from being able to be ourselves and love ourselves fully. The season of Lent is a good time to examine whether or not we might have addictions that are getting in the way of a balanced life. The second part of the balanced life is one that interests me in my role as pastor. As we seek to be fully ourselves, what does it mean to have social and communal responsibility? It might seem like an odd question to ask a bunch of people who go to church. But there is a difference between people who go to church as another volunteer activity or because of guilt or expectations and don't quite make the connection to the communal responsibility part. I want to be clear about one thing, though. I have never believed we have a responsibility to go to church as an activity all on its own. What's at the heart of communal responsibility is what Moss and King were getting at. People who will ask, as Dr. King said, what will happen to humanity if I don't help? What will happen to the civil rights movement if I don't participate? What will happen to my city if I don't vote? What will happen to the sick if I don't visit them? The same question the Samaritan asked. Many of us were brought up in situations that were very individually focused. Our family was all that mattered. We weren't taught to think about humanity or even close neighbors or others. Some of us heard some messages of responsibility at church, but some of those messages were all about converting people to Christianity, making sure people conformed as what really mattered. So what is our communal responsibility? According to today's parable, our responsibility is to be good neighbors, to care for others like we would want them to care for us, as though this were an easy task. In secular places of learning, this is talked about as working for the good of the whole. The idea is that we understand this Kingian idea that if there is a threat to justice anywhere, there's a threat to justice everywhere, and if any suffer, all suffer. This gets us out of the place of thinking that we are all that matters and into a space where we consider ourselves as part of a whole. Dr. Moss adds another dimension to social and communal responsibility in the first chapter of this book. He includes a quote by the writer G.K. Chesterton that says this: "Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten." He talks about the spiritual dragons or zombies or werewolves, which, can just be troubles, right? Because he loves to explore metaphors and paradigms that include heroes or sheroes overcoming the dragons or the other beasts that assail us. Moss claims that part of our spiritual hunger is needing to know that these things that plague us, can be beaten, can be tamed, can be overcome, can be banished. And then Moss says what is most important: if your particular dragons or demons are spiritual, the antidote is to link love and justice. He refers to the work of Dr. Howard Thurman, who had a huge impact on Dr. King. I'm just reading a sentence of my sermon here that doesn't quite make sense, so I'm going to skip over it. Many of us have heard the concept of love and justice being combined. We've even talked about it here. And we repeat it because of the level of difficulty in combining love and justice. Sounds so easy, in reality is so hard to live. Dr. Moss says love without justice is mere sentimentality or emotion. An example of this would be giving water or food to those who live on the streets every now and then, and nothing more. Justice without love, Dr. Moss says, can be ruthless and can turn into revenge and retribution. An example, so using the same example of justice without love, would be working for affordable housing and trying to get more shelters in the city without ever once talking to or interacting with or giving some water to someone living on the streets. Linking the two would be actively loving those who live on the streets while at the same time working for a change in policies or funding in order to provide more permanent housing for those who need it and want it. So part of our social and communal responsibility is to constantly link these two. We love those in front of us while working for systemic change at the same time. This then leads to the third part of our balanced life, which is our sacred kinship and connection with all creation. In Dr. King's concept of a balanced life, he's much more specific and directs this to how we are going to love God. He urges us to search for God because we were made for God and we will be restless until we can rest in God. Moss has expanded this out much further, and he builds on a section of King's sermon where he specifically talks about how we're all tied together whether we realize it or not. King states that everything we have is because of the hand of another, even before we walk out the door to the church. And then he points out your soap, your sponge, your towel, your coffee or tea, your toast. Before you even walk out the door, you've been dependent on more than half the world. We depend on each other, so how are we going to care for each other? And in my own words, for the more than human world that we are also dependent on. Part of the balance we're looking for here is that we not get so wrapped in ourselves or in human supremacy that we forget how much more there is. Dr. King's way of expressing this was to talk about two kinds of atheism, the theoretical and the practical. The theoretical is that you say you just don't believe in the idea of a God. The practical is when you believe in God, but you actually live as if you don't. Of the practical atheist, King says, there are those who become so involved in looking at the human-made lights of the city that they unconsciously forget to rise up and look at that great cosmic light and think about it. That light that gets up in the eastern horizon every morning and moves across the sky with a kind of symphony of motion and paints its technicolor across the blue. A light that humankind can never make. He goes on to say, and we should appreciate this here in Chicago, they become so involved in looking at the skyscraping buildings of the Loop of Chicago or the Empire State Building of New York that they unconsciously forget to think about the gigantic mountains that kiss the skies as if to bathe their peaks in the lofty blue, something that humankind could never make. Part of what we can do to balance our lives in this arena is to pay attention to and notice all of the ways in which God is present and alive and obvious around us. Or if God is still too narrow a concept for you, to do that with all that is sacred and connected in our lives. It's lifting up our heads from what we usually look at and beginning to look differently. Which voices in all of creation are least represented in our lives? Could be the stars, the trees, the birds, the waves. Could even be the voice of silence. As we begin our Lenten path together this year, we are truly in a time of midnight, as Dr. Moss describes it. The times are dark, meaning that they can be confusing. We can easily lose our way. There is fear that abounds, and we are all anxious. Several years ago, Barbara Brown Taylor reminded us in her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, that so many of the most important moments in our lives, and even in the ancient Bible stories and myths that happen, so much happens in the dark. And so the darkness is symbolic of times of incredible growth and strength. We can be in and welcome the darkness because we can trust that incredible things will happen eventually in the darkness, which doesn't mean that in that moment it's not the most terrifying thing we've ever experienced. Moss goes on to say that the concept of midnight also includes the new day, the new light of dawn, because the new day begins on that first stroke after midnight. So where are you right now? Are you in that time just before midnight when there is still so much anxiety and fear? Are you hanging in the balance between midnight and the new day? Are you already into the promise for now of the new dawn? I realize in asking that question that it can change often, so how we might answer today could be completely different from how we're going to answer tomorrow. Where you think you are in that regard can be helpful as you consider the balance or the unbalance that is your current life. The invitation during this Lenten season is to bring into balance in some way that which is out of balance. I want to invite you to do that without berating yourself, without feeling guilty, or in any way feeling less than. We are not geometric shapes that deal with length and breadth and height. We are humans who are constantly living and learning and loving, and sometimes we're balanced and sometimes we're not. So wherever you are in your own journey, remember you are connected to all of us. You're connected to the whole, and you are beloved. Amen.